Welcome back. We're on verdict watch right now in the Hollywood Ripper trial, and we've been covering this trial since May here at Law and Crime. Today, the jury in California will go into its fourth day of deliberations. This is the trial of an accused serial killer, Michael Gargiulo, charged with murdering two women, Ashley Ellerin, Maria Bruno, and the attempted murder of a third, Michelle Murphy. If convicted, Gargiulo could face the death penalty if he's convicted of these killings and found to have been sane at the time of the crimes. The defense has stood strong during the trial and has tried to point the attacks on other suspects, telling jurors that there was no DNA evidence that can link the killings to Gargiulo. Let's listen to the defense's closing arguments. All right, so we have a lot to talk about with the Hollywood Ripper trial. With me to do that, attorney Michael Hilferty, Kirk Burkhalter, and Latonia Hines, prosecutor out of Georgia. Latonia, I'm going to come out to you first. What do you think of this defense claim of the sleepwalking and the dissociative fugue? Does that hold up?
No, not at all. I mean, all of it is like kind of throwing a kitchen sink at it. But the thing about it, too, that's bad is that when the defense attorney said that, you remember we had 3 different victims in here. So when he says that, because some of it you're trying to say that no, his client wasn't even there, it wasn't him. So when you said that, in doing that, you admit that your client is actually in that location. And so on some levels, you have to admit his presence, which takes away some of your other defenses on the other 2 victims. But no, I think that the jury is a very smart jury. And when you're listening to things like that, there just wasn't enough evidence for it. And almost some levels, kind of what the prosecutor said, it's a little insulting to throw that in there, to have you believe that he just all of a sudden was sleepwalking and just didn't know what he was doing when he's like stabbing someone.
All right, Latonia, thanks. And here in the studio, you know, one of the things we've been talking about with this trial since it's been going on is the fact that a lot of this DNA evidence just isn't there in this. And the defense did point that out. Maybe they could have done it stronger or whatever. But Kirk, what do you think about that? I mean, is that going to be a big crux here for this jury?
Well, I thought it was very interesting how the prosecution addressed that fact in their closing. So the defense pointed out how there was no DNA evidence, and the prosecution addressed that fact in their closing by saying, hey, he's a cold, calculating serial killer. And the fact that there was no DNA evidence tends to show how calculating that he was. So that was a rather interesting strategy. It's something juries certainly in this modern age love to see all types of evidence. They know the police have the ability to collect all types of forensic evidence, and they really like that. So the prosecution, I think, did a decent job accounting for the lack of such.
And talking about the jury here, Michael, you know, they're on their 4th day of deliberations. If you're the prosecutor, are you concerned or are you worried that it's taking this long?
Absolutely. As a former criminal defense attorney, I know the longer that a jury is out, the better it is for the defendant. It means they're asking questions, they are looking over everything, you know, going through with a fine-tooth comb. The jurors don't want to be there any more than anyone else wants to be there. So if they're still in there, it's for a reason, and it's usually good for the defense.
All right, so we've now heard both the closing arguments from the defense and the prosecution, as well as the prosecution's rebuttal. Latonia, I'm going to come out to you first. What did you think of that rebuttal there by the prosecution?
I thought it was a very good rebuttal. It's very strong, especially because what they said is, even if you were to believe what the defense is saying about this timeline, there's no way that it could happen. If you believe that they're saying that Mark Durbin is the person who did it, they didn't even give him enough time in their theory to be able to go do this, have these wounds, and to kill the victim. And so I thought that was a good point that they made. So there's not that doubt. And the fact that they were able to illustrate that the defense's own theory of the case has weaknesses, and then come back to here's what we really know to be the facts. The fact that you've got Mark Durbin willing to sit down, do an interview, do whatever's necessary. And as the prosecutor said, it took 4 people, 4 officers to finally get the defendant to be able to get DNA, and showing who would have more of a motive to have committed the crime.
All right, and LaTonya, one of the interesting things about this case is obviously we have the 2 murders and the alleged murder, but we also are included a 4th victim who was allegedly killed by Gargiulo, and that victim is in Chicago. So the prosecution tied all of these together, and the jury was able to look at all 4 of these different instances. Do you think that they did a good job of bringing those all together? And how does that play in this 4th instance with the 3?
Well, so here's what it shows you. One, the whole idea of this dissociative fugue, it's not the case. This guy is a calculated killer, and that's what they're showing. They're showing that he's not it doesn't just happen one time. It happened 3 different times, and that this person is a concentrated, calculated killer, that he has quite a bit of malice and evil, and putting those all together, very powerful for this jury to not believe that it was just some one occasion thing, that this person has this thought process, and that he did this to all of these victims. He is the sole source to all of their injuries.
All right, LaTonya, thanks. Back in the studio here, Michael, one of the things we've been talking about with this is that 4th incident, the one that they have related and brought into this from Chicago. Are you surprised that they were allowed to do that? A lot of times you're not really, I guess, allowed or legally supposed to bring in these outside things to influence the jury here.
Well, I'm not surprised at all, because I think a lot of times, most of the time, the system is rigged against the defendant. So what you see is you have prosecutors overreaching and trying to get in as much evidence as possible. Even if you just listen to that rebuttal, what did they say? They said there were 4 individual instances. They're asking the jury to essentially be less critical. Don't examine each individual instance alone, put them all together. And what happens when you put them all together? Clearly you have 4 victims, 4 very sympathetic victims, and 1 very unsympathetic defendant, and they're asking you to basically, create a timeline of a serial killer. And in that, you can obviously overlook some things which may work in his favor, not necessarily exonerate him, but something that might rise to the level of reasonable doubt.
Right. And Kirk, what do you think about the defense making Ashton Kutcher a big part of their closing?
I think, the defense has a duty to put on the best defense they can. And, this is a celebrity, folks know him. That is their theory that someone else committed the crime. How effective that was, I don't know how effective it ended up being, but it was helpful. It was, the best they could do, I should say.
And going back on what we were just talking about with Michael about the 4th incident being tied into this, would you maybe have wanted them separated? Well,
if I'm the prosecution, you've branded this the defendant a serial killer, and it's certainly a lot easier to convict someone who is branded a serial killer than someone who is just simply a murderer. And if you're going to brand him a serial killer, you're going to consistently flash photos of all 4 of these people together. You're going to talk about all 4 people together. You're going to try to get away with that as much as you can. And juries don't like serial killers, right? So who does? So it's certainly something that works in the favor of the prosecution. If I'm the defense, I certainly want to try to separate this out and have the jury, as Michael said, look at each instance separately.
Yeah, it's interesting because in this trial we have obviously the 4th one from Chicago, but also they could have theoretically broken up these 3, the 2 murders and the attempted murder. As defense, maybe you would have wanted that instead, because as we said, the DNA evidence is a lot stronger, and this pattern repetition, you can show that better when they're all together, but I don't know if you can do that when they're separate. Michael?
Yeah, as soon as you start examining each crime individually, you have more and more facets and facts to consider. And facts basically break down under scrutiny a lot of times. That's the entire basis of the criminal justice system, is you have to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. And a reasonable doubt is a very low standard to set. It's a high standard to overcome, a low standard to set. Once you have that reasonable doubt, that's it. The person is legally supposed to be exonerated.
All right, thanks guys. We have more after the break. Stay with us here on Law and Crime.